January 14, 1967. Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Saigon. Private First Class Michael O'Brien, 19 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, stepped off a C-130 Hercules transport into air so thick it felt like breathing through wet wool. The temperature was 112 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was 90%. The smell hit him before anything else. Jet fuel mixed with sewage, burning trash, and something sweet and rotten he couldn't identify. He would later learn it was the smell of death in tropical heat. O'Brien had been in country for exactly 4 minutes when the first mortar round landed 300 yards from the airstrip. Nobody ran. The veterans waiting to board his plane home, the Freedom Bird they called it, barely looked up. One soldier, his uniform bleached white by sun and repeated washing, laughed at the new arrivals diving for cover. "Welcome to the Nam, cherries," he said, using the slang for new troops. "You'll stop hitting the dirt in about a week or you'll be dead." This was not what the recruiting posters had promised. O'Brien had enlisted in August 1966, 3 months after graduating high school, believing what President Johnson told the nation, that American boys were defending freedom, stopping communist aggression, protecting democracy in Southeast Asia. His father had fought in World War II. His uncle had served in Korea. O'Brien wanted to be part of that tradition, that legacy of American valor. Within 72 hours of arrival, O'Brien would participate in his first combat operation. Within 2 weeks, he would see his first American casualty, a 20-year-old specialist from Georgia who stepped on a mine and disappeared from the waist down. Within a month, O'Brien would stop writing honest letters home. Within 6 months, he would start using marijuana daily. Within 9 months, he would witness a lieutenant murdered by his own men. Within a year, he would rotate home with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and psychological wounds that would never heal. But on January 14, 1967, standing on the tarmac at Tan Son Nhut, Private First Class Michael O'Brien simply picked up his duffel bag and followed the line of new arrivals toward a bus with wire mesh over the windows. The mesh, he was told, was to keep grenades from being thrown inside. He had been in Vietnam for 11 minutes. The war had already begun to destroy him. The official narrative said American forces were invited guests. The reality was immediate and undeniable. Nobody wanted them there. Not the South Vietnamese government America was supposedly defending. Not the rural population caught between two armies. Not even the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, whose soldiers often refused to fight alongside their American allies. Sergeant James Patterson, 1st Infantry Division, described his first patrol through a village near Lai Khe in his diary, dated March 1968. "We walked through and every door closed, every window shuttered. Mothers pulled children inside. Old men turned their backs. We're supposed to be saving these people and they look at us like we're the enemy. Maybe we are." The statistics revealed a war built on false assumptions. By 1967, more than 50% of rural South Vietnamese lived in areas controlled or contested by the Viet Cong. Despite American claims of progress, the enemy moved freely through villages during the day, collecting taxes, recruiting fighters, and gathering intelligence. The population didn't report VC movements to American forces because their neighbors, their cousins, their sons were the Viet Cong. The line between ally and enemy didn't exist. American soldiers learned quickly that the teenager selling Coca-Cola at the base perimeter in the morning might be the one firing mortars at that same base at night. The woman washing laundry for American officers often passed information to VC cadres. The village chief who smiled and cooperated during the day sent his sons to fight Americans after dark. Trust became impossible. Paranoia became survival. Specialist David Hernandez, 25th Infantry Division, wrote to his brother in January 1969, "You can't tell who's who. The kid who shined my boots yesterday, his brother tried to kill me last night. We arrested him. 2 days later, he's back on base, shining boots again. Somebody in Saigon let him go. We're not allowed to win this thing." The South Vietnamese Army, the force America spent billions training and equipping, proved unreliable at best, hostile at worst. Desertion rates in ARVN units reached 20% annually by 1968. Entire battalions refused combat orders. ARVN soldiers sold American weapons and ammunition to the Viet Cong. Corruption was so endemic that American supplies disappeared before reaching combat units. One study estimated that 40% of all U.S. military aid to South Vietnam ended up on the black market. American troops developed bitter nicknames for their supposed allies. ARVN became "aren't really very neighborly" or "all run very nervous." Joint operations became nightmares of miscommunication, refusal to advance, and Vietnamese units abandoning positions. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert testified before Congress in 1971 that he witnessed ARVN units deliberately firing into American positions and then claiming confusion. The political leadership American soldiers were ordered to defend was equally repellent. The Saigon government, propped up by American money and firepower, was a revolving door of military strongmen, each more corrupt than the last. President Nguyen Van Thieu's family controlled the heroin trade. Province chiefs extorted peasants. Police tortured civilians. American soldiers watched their Vietnamese counterparts commit atrocities and were ordered to ignore them in the name of alliance unity. Captain Brian Wilson, stationed in Binh Dinh province, later testified, "We were told we were fighting for democracy and freedom. The government we supported was a dictatorship. The people we killed were often the only ones actually trying to help the peasants. Nothing made sense. The enemy had a reason to fight. We didn't." By 1969, the disillusionment was complete. American soldiers stopped believing in the mission because the mission had no basis in reality. The domino theory, the containment of communism, the defense of freedom, these were abstractions that dissolved on first contact with Vietnam. The truth was simpler and uglier. American soldiers were dying in a civil war where both sides hated them, for a government nobody respected in support of a strategy that couldn't succeed. Private First Class Charles Strong, in a letter to his girlfriend dated November 1969, wrote 12 words that captured the fundamental horror. "We're the invaders here. They want us gone. We all know it." The first ugly truth of being an American soldier in Vietnam was this: you were not a liberator. You were not wanted. You were not welcome. Every day in country reinforced that reality. Every patrol through hostile villages, every ambush sprung by people who looked like allies, every smile that concealed hatred. The war America claimed to be fighting didn't exist. The war that actually existed couldn't be won, and 58,000 Americans would die in it anyway. The statistics of the Vietnam War tell a story the Pentagon tried desperately to hide. In World War II, the average American soldier was 26 years old. In Vietnam, he was 19. The military draft pulled teenagers straight from high school hallways into jungle warfare. Between 1965 and 1973, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. Their average tour length was exactly 365 days, a countdown every soldier kept obsessively, marking time until the Freedom Bird carried them home. If they survived. 61% of Americans killed in Vietnam were 21 years old or younger. The youngest American combat death was Marine Corps Private Dan Bullock, killed in action on June 7, 1969, at Quang Nam Province. He was 15 years old. He had lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was Kenna Clyde Taylor, killed at 52. Between those ages stretched a generation. The casualty rates were staggering and grossly unequal. African Americans made up 11% of the American population, but 12.5% of combat deaths in the early years. By 1968, after political pressure and policy changes, that percentage decreased, but the damage to black communities was permanent. The draft boards in poor and minority neighborhoods were ruthless. The draft boards in wealthy white suburbs found ways to grant deferments. College deferments protected the privileged. Between 1964 and 1973, only 2% of Harvard graduates served in Vietnam. Project 100,000, launched by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1966, lowered military entrance standards to accept men previously rejected for low test scores or minor criminal records. The program was marketed as social uplift. It was actually a body harvest. Of the 354,000 men brought into service through Project 100,000, a disproportionate number were assigned to combat roles. Their death rate was twice that of other servicemen. The daily reality was relentless. The average infantryman in Vietnam carried 70 to 80 pounds of equipment through jungle, rice paddies, and mountains. He faced an enemy who knew the terrain, had unlimited patience, and could disappear into civilian populations. American soldiers spent 240 days per year in the field, compared to 40 days for World War II infantrymen. The pace was unsustainable. Casualty statistics reveal the futility. In 1968 alone, 16,592 Americans died in Vietnam. That single year exceeded total American combat deaths in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. By 1969, when public support had collapsed and withdrawal was inevitable, soldiers were still dying at a rate of 300 per week. They were dying for a war America had already decided to abandon. Friendly fire killed more Americans than officially acknowledged. Estimates suggest 10 to 15% of American casualties came from American weapons. Misdirected artillery, mistaken airstrikes, confused firefights in dense jungle where visibility was 10 feet. The official number was never released. The Pentagon classified it as strategically sensitive. Then there were the numbers the military didn't count. In 1971, the Department of Defense estimated that 50% of enlisted men in Vietnam used marijuana regularly. Some studies put the number at 70%. Heroin use reached epidemic levels. The heroin available in Vietnam was 95% pure, compared to 5% purity on American streets. It was cheap, everywhere, and soldiers used it to self-medicate against fear, boredom, moral injury, and existential despair. By 1971, the Pentagon estimated 10 to 15% of soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin. The actual number was likely higher. Medical evacuations for psychiatric reasons reached 23 per 1,000 troops by 1971. Combat refusal incidents rose dramatically. In 1970, there were at least 209 documented fragging incidents, soldiers attempting to kill their own officers with fragmentation grenades. 37 officers and NCOs were murdered by their own men that year. The number increased to over 300 incidents in 1971. These were not accidents or enemy action. These were mutinies. The body count obsession, McNamara's metric for measuring success, led to systematic inflation and grotesque distortion. Commanders needed high enemy kill numbers to justify operations and advance careers. The result was civilian massacres reported as combat victories. Viet Cong killed in action often included women, children, and elderly farmers. American soldiers knew the numbers were fraudulent. The Pentagon presented them to Congress as proof of progress. Then came the ugliest number of all. Between 1973 and 2023, more Vietnam veterans died by suicide than were killed in combat. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates between 125,000 and 150,000 veteran suicides in the 50 years following the war. That number exceeds twice the total American combat deaths in Vietnam. The war didn't end when soldiers came home. It followed them for decades. The numbers don't lie. They reveal a catastrophe that America still hasn't fully confronted, a generation sacrificed for a strategy that failed from the beginning. Private First Class O'Brien survived Vietnam. He shot himself in his Cleveland apartment in 1983. He was 35 years old. What American soldiers wrote home and what they actually experienced were two different wars. The gap between the sanitized letters parents received and the reality recorded in private diaries reveals the psychological torture of Vietnam. Soldiers learned quickly to lie to the people they loved most. Marine Lance Corporal Stephen Litz wrote two versions of the same day, in February 1968, during the Battle of Hue, the letter to his mother in Pennsylvania. "Don't worry about me. We're staying safe and the South Vietnamese people are grateful for our help. The food isn't great, but we're managing. I'll be home before you know it." His diary entry from the same day. "We shot a woman today. She was probably VC. Probably. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. Henderson is dead. Martinez lost both legs. I can't stop shaking. I can't tell Mom any of this." The censorship was both official and self-imposed. The military read letters randomly. looking for operational security breaches or morale problems. But the deeper censorship came from soldiers themselves, who understood that the truth would destroy their families. How do you tell your father, a World War II veteran, that this war has no heroes? How do you tell your girlfriend that you participated in burning villages? How do you tell your mother that you've seen children dead in ditches? Specialist Robert Santos kept a meticulous record of the lies he told. In a journal entry from July 1969, he listed them. Told them I'm eating well. Lie. Told them the Vietnamese appreciate us. Lie. Told them I haven't been in serious danger. Lie. Told them I believe in the mission. Lie. Told them I'll be okay when I get home. That's the biggest lie of all. The letters that did tell the truth often arrived after the soldier had died. Private First Class Michael Clancy, killed in Quang Tri Province on September 3, 1969, wrote to his sister 3 days before his death, "I don't know why we're here. Nobody does. We kill people who look exactly like the people we're supposed to be protecting. Yesterday we destroyed a village to save it. I watched a staff sergeant shoot an old man for no reason except frustration. We all saw it. Nobody reported it. I'm becoming someone I don't recognize." His sister received that letter 4 days after receiving the telegram informing her of his death. She never showed it to their parents. The diary of Sergeant Anthony Woods, 101st Airborne, survived him. He was killed by a booby trap near Tam Kai on November 18, 1970. His entries from the weeks before his death are a descent into moral paralysis. October 29th, participated in interrogation today. They tortured a prisoner. I didn't stop it. October 31st, found a tunnel complex, used tear gas and grenades, heard screaming inside, women and children probably. November 4th, Henderson fragged Lieutenant Morrison last night. Whole platoon knows. Nobody's saying anything. November 10th, I don't recognize the person I've become here. November 15th, 3 more days in the field. I just want to survive. 3 days later, he was dead. The gap between official casualty notifications and reality was equally stark. Families received clinical telegrams. The Secretary of the Army has asked me to express his deep regret that your son was killed in action, in defense of his country. They didn't mention that killed in action often meant death by booby trap, or friendly fire, or suicide disguised as combat loss, or fragging by fellow Americans who had stopped believing in military hierarchy. Gold Star mothers, women who lost sons in Vietnam, began comparing notes in 1969 and discovered systematic dishonesty. Their sons' personal effects arrived cleaned and censored, diaries with critical entries torn out, letters pre-screened, photographs removed. The Department of Defense was managing grief, packaging death, and hiding the truth even from bereaved families. Some soldiers stopped writing altogether. Corporal David Bowman sent 17 letters home in his first 3 months in Vietnam. Over his final 9 months in country, he sent 3. His mother kept them all. The last one, dated August 1970, was 8 sentences long. Still alive. Don't know for how much longer. Everyone here is counting days. Trust no one. See things I can't unsee. Don't write back, I won't get letters anyway. I love you. Forget who I was, I'm not him anymore. He survived Vietnam. He committed suicide in 1978. The unspoken truth revealed in these letters and diaries is that soldiers knew immediately that the war was wrong, unwinnable, and morally corrupting. They knew before the American public knew. They knew before Congress knew. They knew before presidents admitted it. And they kept that knowledge to themselves because telling the truth would mean admitting they were participating in an atrocity. So they lied, they minimized, they reassured families that everything was fine while watching their friends die for nothing. The letters home were acts of mercy. The diaries were acts of witness. Together they document a crime against an entire generation. Vietnam's terrain didn't just challenge American soldiers. It broke them. Every ecosystem in the country was engineered to kill. The Pentagon called it difficult terrain. Veterans called it hell in different climates. The Central Highlands were vertical jungle mountains where triple canopy forest blocked sunlight. Platoons hacked through vegetation so dense that visibility extended 3 feet. Navigation was impossible. Maps were useless. Soldiers walked in circles for days. The Viet Cong controlled the high ground, had pre-positioned supply caches and knew every trail. Fire-base construction required helicopters to drop equipment and artillery onto hilltops, cleared by napalm and defoliants. These fire bases, Ripcord, Berchtesgaden, Marianne, became isolated targets surrounded by enemy forces. Private Dennis Walker, 4th Infantry Division, described the A Shau Valley in a letter dated April 1969. "It rains every day, we're never dry, leeches attach while you sleep. Everything rots, uniforms, boots, skin. The jungle is so thick the enemy can be 5 feet away and you can't see them. We found a bunker complex yesterday that could hold 500 men. They watched us walk past it 3 times last week." The Mekong Delta was the opposite extreme. Rice paddies stretched to the horizon, offering no cover. Soldiers waded waist-deep through water thick with sewage, snakes, and disease. Every dike could hide a Viet Cong fighter. Every tree line could conceal an ambush. The VC controlled the Delta villages completely. American units conducted search-and-destroy missions during the day, then retreated to fortified positions at night while the enemy moved freely through the same territory. The Cu Chi district, just 30 miles from Saigon, contained 250 kilometers of tunnels. The tunnel networks had hospitals, weapons factories, sleeping quarters, and command centers underground. American tunnel rats, soldiers small enough to crawl into these tunnels armed only with flashlights and pistols, had the most psychologically devastating job in Vietnam. They fought in absolute darkness, in spaces sometimes only 2 feet wide, against an enemy that knew every turn and had rigged the tunnels with booby traps, snakes, and scorpions. Sergeant Arnold Gutierrez, tunnel rat, 25th Infantry Division, testified in 1971, "You go down into complete blackness. You can't turn around. You can't back up fast. You hear breathing but don't know if it's you or someone waiting to kill you. Sometimes we found dead VC. Sometimes we found dead Americans from previous operations. The smell never leaves you. I did that job for 4 months. I should have died down there 20 times." The DMZ, the demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam, was the most heavily bombed area in human history. By 1968, the strip of land had been hit with more ordnance than all of World War II. The landscape was cratered, scorched, and poisoned. No vegetation survived. Unexploded ordnance covered every meter. Marines at bases like Con Thien and Khe Sanh lived underground while North Vietnamese artillery fired from positions just across the border. The shelling was constant. Resupply was by air only. Casualties were evacuated by helicopter during brief lulls in bombardment. Men went mad from the noise. Operation Pegasus, the relief of Khe Sanh in April 1968, required 30,000 troops to advance 8 miles. The North Vietnamese had prepared the battlefield for months. Every meter was registered for artillery. American forces found bunker complexes carved into mountainsides, supply depots stocked with months of ammunition, and elaborate tunnel systems connecting defensive positions. The NVA simply retreated when American firepower became overwhelming, then reoccupied after American forces withdrew. The cycle repeated endlessly. The Ia Drang Valley, site of the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces in November 1965, established the pattern. Lieutenant General Harold G. Moore led the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry into an LZ landing zone, surrounded by enemy forces. The battle lasted 4 days. American artillery fired 33,000 rounds. B-52 bombers dropped hundreds of tons of ordnance. American forces counted 834 enemy dead. American casualties: 79 killed, 121 wounded. The Pentagon declared it a victory. The North Vietnamese learned they could absorb horrific casualties and still fight. They learned that American forces would always retreat to bases after engagements. They learned that the jungle would protect them. By 1968, the geography of Vietnam had become a weapon turned against American forces. The heat averaged 95 degrees with 90% humidity. Soldiers carried 80 pounds of equipment through terrain that veterans of World War II said was impossible. Malaria infected 60% of soldiers in some units. Jungle rot, immersion foot, Heat stroke and dysentery were constant. Medical evacuations for disease exceeded combat casualties in many months. The NVA and Viet Cong didn't need to defeat American forces in battle. The country itself did that job. Every mountain, every rice paddy, every tunnel system, every kilometer of jungle was an ally to the enemy and a death trap for American soldiers. You couldn't pacify geography. You couldn't win a political victory over terrain. The Pentagon never understood that fundamental reality. The soldiers understood it within days of arrival. The Vietnam War killed Americans in ways the Pentagon never wanted to discuss. Official enemy action was one thing. Americans killing Americans was something else entirely. By 1970, the war within the war, American soldiers turning weapons on their own officers and each other, had become a crisis that threatened the military's entire structure. Friendly fire incidents were epidemic and underreported. The Department of Defense never released comprehensive statistics, but internal studies suggested 10 to 15% of American casualties came from American weapons. Artillery fell on American positions due to miscommunication, incorrect coordinates, or sheer chaos. Airstrikes hit friendly forces because forward air controllers misidentified targets or pilots released ordnance on the wrong grid coordinates. In the jungle, where visibility was measured in feet and firefights were confused, American units fired on each other regularly. The battle for Hill 875 near Dak 2 in November 1967 illustrated the horror. Companies of the 173rd Airborne Brigade assaulted a fortified North Vietnamese position. After hours of brutal combat, an American F-100 Super Sabre dropped two 500-pound bombs directly on American positions. The bombs killed 42 paratroopers instantly and wounded 45 more. Soldiers already traumatized by enemy fire now had to watch their friends torn apart by American aircraft. The official after-action report classified it as tragic error. Survivors called it mass murder by incompetence. Specialist Michael Clune, who survived Hill 875, wrote in his diary, "We got hit by our own planes. Nobody knows why. Nobody will be punished. We lost more men to that airstrike than we did to the NVA. How do you trust command after that? How do you believe anything they tell you?" But friendly fire was accidental. Fragging was deliberate murder. The term came from fragmentation grenades, the weapon of choice for soldiers who wanted to kill their own officers. Fragmentation grenades left no ballistic evidence, were easily obtained, and caused damage that could conceivably be attributed to enemy action. Roll a grenade into an officer's tent at night, and by morning, that incompetent lieutenant who ordered suicidal patrols would be dead. The practice became so common that officers in combat zones slept in different locations each night and wore flak jackets inside their own perimeters. The statistics are incomplete because the military actively suppressed them. The Pentagon admitted to 209 fragging incidents in 1970 and over 300 in 1971. Those numbers included only attacks with grenades and only incidents that were investigated. The actual number was certainly higher. Some estimates suggest more than 1,000 fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. Officers were also killed by accidental shootings during combat, left behind during patrols, or beaten by groups of soldiers who were never identified. The reasons were obvious. By 1969, the war was demonstrably lost, but continued anyway. Soldiers were ordered to take hills, suffer casualties, then abandon the hills days later. Officers advancing their careers ordered dangerous patrols to inflate body counts. Junior enlisted men, average age 19, were expected to die for the ambitions of senior officers who rotated home to promotions after 6-month command tours. The social contract between officers and enlisted men collapsed. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Heinel, a Marine Corps historian, published an article in Armed Forces Journal in 1971 titled, "The Collapse of the Armed Forces." He wrote, "By every conceivable indicator, our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers and non-commissioned officers, drug-ridden and dispirited where not near mutinous." The marijuana epidemic enabled this collapse. By 1971, Marijuana was so common that entire units operated in various states of intoxication. Soldiers smoked before patrols, during guard duty, and in base camps. Officers who tried to enforce drug policies risked retaliation. The unspoken agreement became, "We won't report drug use if you don't order us into suicidal operations." Sergeant Gary Jackson, 1st Cavalry Division, described the breakdown in testimony before Congress. "We had a captain who wanted a body count to put in his report. He ordered us to sweep a village we knew was fortified. We told him it was suicide. He threatened court-martial. That night, someone rolled a grenade into his hooch. He survived but lost both legs. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. The investigation went nowhere." Combat refusal incidents escalated alongside fraggings. In 1970, an entire platoon of the 1st Air Cavalry Division refused a direct order to advance down a dangerous road. In 1971, significant numbers of soldiers simply stopped patrolling. They conducted search-and-avoid missions, moving into the jungle, sitting down, and radioing false position reports while avoiding contact with the enemy. Officers who pushed too hard didn't last long. The phrase "don't mean nothing" became the unofficial motto of disillusioned soldiers. A friend killed in an ambush? Don't mean nothing. Ordered to burn a village? Don't mean nothing. The war's futility? Don't mean nothing. The psychological defense mechanism of nihilism protected soldiers from moral injury, but also severed them from military discipline, unit cohesion, and command authority. By 1972, the American military in Vietnam had effectively mutinied without ever formally declaring mutiny. Soldiers fought to survive their 365-day tours, not to win an unwinnable war, and they were willing to kill anyone, including their own officers, who threatened that survival. By 1970, the American military in Vietnam faced an enemy it couldn't bomb, shoot, or napalm, its own soldiers' addiction crisis. The drug epidemic in Vietnam was unprecedented in military history. It wasn't recreational use. It was mass self-medication against a war that had shattered minds before bodies. Marijuana was universal. Estimates from military studies suggested 70 to 80% of American soldiers in Vietnam used marijuana at least occasionally. For many, it was daily. The drug was cheap, everywhere, and openly tolerated because officers knew that enforcing prohibition would trigger outright mutiny. Soldiers smoked before patrols, during guard duty, and inside base perimeters. The smell of marijuana mixed with diesel fuel became the signature scent of American fire bases. But marijuana was just the beginning. The real crisis was heroin. Vietnam-era heroin was 95% pure. On American streets, heroin purity averaged 5%. In Vietnam, pure heroin was cheaper than beer, sold openly by Vietnamese civilians with tacit approval from corrupt ARVN officers and local officials. A vial cost $2. By 1971, the Pentagon estimated that 10 to 15% of American soldiers were using heroin. Some studies suggested the number reached 25% in certain units. The delivery method made it easier to hide. Soldiers didn't inject, they smoked it. Chasing the dragon, they called it. Heroin was mixed with tobacco or marijuana and smoked from cigarettes. No needles meant no track marks. No track marks meant officers couldn't identify users on inspection. The epidemic spread invisibly until it became too widespread to conceal. Specialist Raymond Cruz, 9th Infantry Division, described the descent in a letter to his brother dated August 1971. "Half my unit is on smack. We smoke it before patrol so we don't care if we die. Nobody's pretending anymore. Officers know but don't report it because then they'd have to admit they've lost control. I've been using for 3 months. It's the only way to make this place tolerable. I'm going to die here, either from a bullet or from this drug. Both feel equally likely." Cruz survived Vietnam. He died of a heroin overdose in Oakland, California, in 1974. The military's response to the crisis was denial followed by panic. In May 1971, 2 congressmen visiting Vietnam reported widespread heroin use to the press. The story exploded. Suddenly, the American public learned that their sons weren't just dying in combat. They were returning as addicts. President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and ordered the military to implement urinalysis testing. Operation Golden Flow began in June 1971. Every soldier departing Vietnam had to pass a urinalysis test before boarding the Freedom Bird. Those who tested positive were held in-country for detoxification. The policy was disaster. Soldiers simply switched from heroin, which stayed in the system for days, to marijuana, which cleared faster. Some used diuretics and drank massive amounts of water. Others bribed Vietnamese laboratory technicians to falsify results. The testing regime identified approximately 5% of departing soldiers as drug users. The actual percentage was many times higher. The addiction epidemic revealed deeper truths. Soldiers used drugs because the war was psychologically unsustainable. They used drugs because they didn't believe in the mission. They used drugs because 18-year-olds couldn't process watching friends die for hills that were abandoned days later. They used drugs because the alternative was confronting the moral horror of what they'd become. Psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who studied Vietnam veterans, identified psychic numbing as the fundamental survival mechanism. Soldiers shut down emotionally to function in an environment of constant death and moral injury. Drugs facilitated that numbing. Marijuana softened edges. Heroin erased feeling entirely. The military created conditions that required emotional shutdown, then punished soldiers for finding chemical means to achieve it. The long-term consequences devastated lives. Studies conducted in the 1970s found that approximately 20% of Vietnam veterans struggled with substance abuse after returning home. The heroin epidemic in American cities during the 1970s was directly fueled by veterans who had developed addictions in Vietnam. The VA healthcare system, overwhelmed and underfunded, failed to provide adequate treatment. Veterans with addiction issues were stigmatized, denied benefits, and abandoned. Lieutenant William Calley Jr., far infamous for the My Lai massacre, testified that his unit used marijuana regularly before operations. Colonel Robert Heinl's 1971 assessment noted that drug abuse has become a major tactical problem, affecting combat readiness across all services. By 1972, the military estimated that drug-related incidents cost 1,000 man-hours per week per division. Units were combat ineffective not because of enemy action, but because soldiers were too intoxicated to fight. The Pentagon never released comprehensive statistics on drug-related deaths in Vietnam. How many soldiers died because their fire team was high during an ambush? How many died because the soldier supposed to be on guard duty was smoking heroin? How many died because officers were too afraid of their own men to enforce sobriety? The answers were classified. Private First Class James Morrison wrote in his diary 2 weeks before his death in September 1971, "We're all self-medicating. It's either get high or face what we're actually doing here. Most of us choose the drugs. I don't blame them. I choose the drugs too." He was killed during a patrol. The official report didn't mention that half his unit was high at the time. There is a moment in every impossible war when soldiers stop pretending. In Vietnam, that moment came in 1969 and spread like contagion through 1971. The psychological collapse wasn't gradual, it was systemic. Men who had followed orders, believed in the mission, and trusted their commanders simply stopped. They refused combat, ignored officers, and collectively decided that survival mattered more than victory. The American military in Vietnam didn't withdraw. It disintegrated from within. The catalyzing event was the realization that the war was already lost while soldiers were still dying. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 had proven the enemy could strike anywhere, despite years of American promises that victory was near. Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted journalist, declared the war unwinnable in February 1968. President Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election in March 1968. Peace talks began in Paris in May 1968. The war was effectively over in strategic terms, but American soldiers continued dying at a rate of 300 per week throughout 1969 and 1970. They were dying for nothing, and they knew it. Specialist Thomas Bailey, 101st Airborne, described the breaking point in testimony given years later. "We assaulted Hamburger Hill in May 1969. Took 10 days. Lost 72 men killed, 372 wounded. We took that hill, planted a flag, then abandoned it a week later. The NVA moved right back in. That's when I understood. We weren't trying to win. We were just trying to make it look like we were trying. After that, nobody believed in anything anymore. The battle for Hamburger Hill, officially Hill 937 near the Laotian border, became the symbolic turning point. The 101st Airborne assaulted a fortified North Vietnamese position for 10 brutal days in May 1969. The hill had no strategic value. It wasn't near supply lines or population centers. The only reason to take it was because the enemy was there. After suffering massive casualties in repeated frontal assaults, American forces finally took the summit on May 20th. On May 27th, they abandoned it. The North Vietnamese reoccupied it without resistance. Life magazine published photographs of the 241 Americans killed or wounded on Hamburger Hill under the headline, "The Faces of the American Dead in Vietnam, 1 Week's Toll." Senator Edward Kennedy called it senseless and irresponsible. Soldiers in Vietnam read those articles and drew their conclusions. Their lives meant nothing to the people ordering them into combat. Combat refusal incidents increased dramatically. In August 1969, a company of the 196th Light Infantry Brigade refused orders to advance down a road known to be heavily mined. The company commander threatened courts-martial. The soldiers didn't move. Eventually, helicopters evacuated them. No courts-martial followed because the Pentagon feared publicity. If the American public learned that combat troops were refusing orders en masse, the war would become politically unsustainable. It already was. The phrase, "search and avoid," became common. Units ordered on patrol would move into the jungle, find a defensible position, sit down, and radio false position reports throughout the day. They avoided the enemy deliberately. Officers who tried to enforce aggressive patrolling risked fragging. By 1970, large portions of the American military in Vietnam were simply waiting out their tours, conducting minimal operations, and hoping to survive. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert testified before Congress about an incident in 1969 where an entire battalion refused combat orders. "I watched a colonel threaten 500 men with courts-martial if they didn't advance. The men told him to go ahead and try. What was he going to do, court-martial an entire battalion? The press would love that story. He backed down. The mission was canceled." The psychological damage manifested in surreal ways. Combat veterans reported feeling more afraid of their own mental state than of enemy action. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 25th Infantry Division, wrote in November 1970, "I've killed people I'm not sure were enemy. I've watched villages burn that didn't need to burn. I've participated in atrocities I'll never be able to confess. The worst part isn't that I did these things. The worst part is that I stopped feeling anything about them. I'm dead inside and still walking around." Psychiatric casualties overwhelmed the military medical system. By 1971, medical evacuations for psychiatric reasons reached 23 per 1,000 troops. The actual number was higher because many psychological breaks were misdiagnosed as physical ailments or ignored entirely. Soldiers having mental health crises were often sedated and returned to duty. The term acute situational reaction became military code for psychotic break. Treatment consisted of rest, sedation, and return to combat within days. The My Lai massacre, though it occurred in March 1968, wasn't revealed to the American public until November 1969. The photographs, civilians murdered in ditches, children shot at close range, an elderly woman begging for her life before execution, proved what soldiers had been saying privately for years. The war had no moral boundaries. Lieutenant William Calley and his platoon had murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians. The military covered it up for 18 months. When journalist Seymour Hersh finally broke the story, it confirmed every soldier's worst suspicion. Command didn't care about rules, morality, or law. They cared about body counts and the appearance of progress. The psychological breaking point came when soldiers realized three things simultaneously. First, the war was unwinnable and already lost. Second, they were still expected to die for it anyway. Third, the people ordering them to die faced no consequences for their failures, their lies, or their crimes. That combination destroyed military cohesion, unit morale, and individual sanity. Captain Brian Wilson, who resigned his commission in 1969, described it. "I couldn't order men to die for something I knew was a lie. I couldn't ask 18-year-olds to kill people when I wasn't sure who the enemy was. I couldn't participate in the moral crime of pretending this war had purpose. So I quit." Most soldiers didn't have that option. They just broke internally and continued functioning as hollow men. By 1971, the American military in Vietnam was psychologically shattered. Units operated at minimal effectiveness. Drug abuse was epidemic. Officers feared their own men. Combat operations were avoided whenever possible. The soldiers weren't cowards. They were realists. They had reached the rational conclusion that survival mattered more than false victories in an already lost war. The breaking point wasn't weakness. It was sanity asserting itself against institutional madness. And it came too late for the 58,220 Americans who died in Vietnam. Too late for the millions of Vietnamese killed. Too late for a generation that would never recover from what they had seen, done, and become. Private First Class Daniel McCarthy, in his final letter home before his death in February 1971, wrote, "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I believe. I don't know if I'll ever be normal again. I just know this war destroyed something inside me that I'll never get back." He was 20 years old. The Freedom Bird landed at Travis Air Force Base, California, or McChord Air Force Base, Washington, and the nightmare didn't end. It transformed. Vietnam veterans returned to an America that didn't want to acknowledge them, didn't want to hear their stories, and blamed them for a war they didn't start and couldn't win. There were no parades. There were no welcomes. There was just silence, hostility, and a society determined to forget as quickly as possible. World War II veterans had returned to ticker tape parades in New York, the GI Bill, and a grateful nation. Korea veterans received less fanfare but still came home to respect. Vietnam veterans arrived in the middle of the night, were processed through military bases in hours, and dispersed into civilian life within days. The transition from combat zone to civilian society happened so fast that many veterans later described it as more traumatic than the war itself. Specialist Michael Lyons landed at Travis Air Force Base in March 1971, after 13 months in combat with the 1st Infantry Division. He described the return in an interview decades later. "We landed at 0200 hours. They processed us through like cattle. By 1400 hours the same day, I was on a commercial flight to Boston wearing my uniform. At the airport, a woman spit on me and called me a baby killer. I'd been in California for 12 hours. 12 hours earlier, I'd been in a war zone. I couldn't process what was happening." The baby killer accusations were real and frequent. Anti-war activists, unable to strike directly at policymakers, targeted returning soldiers. Veterans were called murderers, war criminals, and worse. The accusations weren't entirely wrong. Atrocities had occurred, civilian casualties were massive, and the moral boundaries of the war had collapsed. But the 19-year-old draftee who had no choice about going to Vietnam bore the anger meant for generals and politicians who had chosen the war. The employment discrimination was systemic. By 1972, the unemployment rate for Vietnam veterans aged 20 to 24 was 11%, nearly double the national rate. Employers saw Vietnam veteran on a resume and imagined drug addicts, criminals, or psychologically unstable men who would snap violently. The stigma followed veterans for years. Many stopped mentioning their service entirely. The VA healthcare system was overwhelmed, underfunded, and institutionally hostile. The Veterans Administration hospitals were dumping grounds for men the country wanted to forget. Wait times for appointments stretched months. Disability claims were routinely denied. The term post-traumatic stress disorder didn't officially exist until 1980. Before that, veterans suffering psychological trauma were diagnosed with adjustment disorder or dismissed as weak. Treatment consisted primarily of sedatives and advice to move on. Sergeant James Simmons returned from Vietnam in 1970 with chronic nightmares, hypervigilance, and uncontrollable rage. He sought help from the VA. The psychiatrist told him he needed to toughen up and prescribed sleeping pills. Simmons became addicted to pills, lost his job, alienated his family, and ended up homeless. In 1978, he walked into a VA hospital and set himself on fire in the lobby. He survived with third-degree burns over 60% of his body. His suicide note read, "You sent me to hell, then you abandoned me there." The suicide statistics are incomplete because the government didn't track them systematically. The VA estimates that between 125,000 and 150,000 Vietnam veterans have died by suicide in the 50 years since the war ended. That's more than twice the number killed in combat. The peak suicide years were 1975 to 1985, the decade immediately after the war when veterans were trying to reintegrate into a society that rejected them. The divorce rate among Vietnam veterans reached 75% by 1980. Marriages couldn't survive what the war had done to men. Wives couldn't recognize husbands who woke up screaming, who couldn't hold jobs, who self-medicated with alcohol and drugs, who became violent without warning. The soldiers who survived Vietnam often destroyed their families years later through the slow burn of psychological trauma. Hollywood didn't help. Films like The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now portrayed Vietnam veterans as mentally unstable, violence-prone, and damaged beyond repair. The cultural image became fixed. The Vietnam vet was either a ticking time bomb or a broken victim. The complex reality that most veterans returned and tried desperately to live normal lives despite profound trauma was ignored in favor of sensational stereotypes. It took until 1982 for America to acknowledge what it had done to Vietnam veterans. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. on November 13, 1982. The wall, 69,000 names of the dead etched in black granite, became the national apology that was never spoken. Veterans gathered there to touch names of friends, to weep, to finally grieve in a place that recognized their service and their loss. Jan Scruggs, the veteran who led the effort to build the memorial, said, "The wall is the country's way of saying we're sorry. Sorry for sending you to an impossible war. Sorry for abandoning you when you came home. Sorry for not believing you. Sorry it took so long to say any of this." But apologies don't resurrect the dead. They don't heal PTSD. They don't restore lost decades to addiction, homelessness, and psychological torment. The wall is beautiful and necessary and 20 years too late. Marine Corporal Lewis Puller, Jr., son of the legendary Marine Lieutenant General Chesty Puller, lost both legs and parts of both hands to a booby trap in Vietnam in 1968. He became a lawyer, wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, and struggled with depression, alcoholism, and PTSD for 25 years. On May 11, 1994, he shot himself to death. His suicide note mentioned the war, always the war. Even 26 years after coming home, Vietnam still killed him. The ugly truth of coming home was that the war never ended for those who fought it. It followed them through failed marriages, lost jobs, addiction, and decades of nightmares. America wanted to forget Vietnam. The veterans couldn't. They carried it in their bodies, their minds, and their broken spirits until death finally released them. And for many, death came not from enemy bullets in the jungle, but from their own hands in quiet American rooms, decades after the last helicopter left Saigon. 3 generations have passed since the last American soldier left Vietnam on March 29, 1973. 52 years since the fall of Saigon. The men who fought that war are now in their 70s and 80s. Many are dead. The country has moved on. But the legacy of what those soldiers endured, and what was done to them, remains unresolved. The average Vietnam veteran today is 74 years old. Approximately 600,000 are still alive out of the 2.7 million who served in country. They die at a rate of approximately 500 per day. By 2030, the vast majority will be gone. Their stories will become history, then memory, then eventually footnotes. But the lessons of their experience should be permanent. The first lesson: never send soldiers to fight a war the nation hasn't committed to winning. Vietnam was a limited war with unlimited costs. Politicians imposed restrictions that made military victory impossible, then blamed the military for not achieving it. Soldiers paid the price for that strategic incoherence. They were ordered to take hills, then abandon them. They were told to win hearts and minds while dropping napalm on villages. They were measured by body counts in a war where body counts meant nothing. The contradictions destroyed them. The second lesson: never draft an army for a war the population doesn't support. The volunteer force that has fought America's wars since 1973 is a direct response to Vietnam. Conscription created an army of unwilling soldiers who didn't believe in the mission and couldn't wait to leave. It created class resentment when the wealthy and connected avoided service through deferments while working-class teenagers were sent to die. The all-volunteer force has its own problems. It isolates military service from civilian society. But it prevents the specific horror of drafting teenagers to fight unpopular wars. The third lesson: treat veterans as if their service mattered, even when the war didn't. The abandonment of Vietnam veterans was a national disgrace. The VA system has improved significantly since the 1970s, but chronic underfunding and bureaucratic dysfunction still betray the promise America makes to its soldiers. Every veteran waiting months for an appointment, every disability claim denied without justification, every homeless veteran sleeping in an American street is proof that the lesson hasn't been learned. The reconciliation with Vietnam began slowly. In 1995, the United States normalized diplomatic relations with Vietnam. In 2000, President Bill Clinton became the first American president to visit unified Vietnam. Today, Vietnam is a trading partner, a tourist destination, and increasingly an American ally against Chinese expansion. The Vietnamese people moved on. They rebuilt. They forgave, if not forgot. Many American veterans returned to Vietnam in the decades after the war. They visited battlefields, met former enemies, and tried to make peace with what they'd experienced. Some found healing in those journeys. Others found only confirmation that the war had been pointless. The Vietnamese they met didn't hate them. They barely remembered them. The war that defined American veterans' lives was simply one phase in Vietnam's century-long struggle for independence. Americans were just another foreign invader, like the French before them and the Chinese before that. The children of Vietnam veterans, Generation X and elder millennials, grew up with fathers who didn't talk about the war, who had nightmares, who self-medicated, who sometimes exploded in rage. The trauma wasn't contained to the veterans themselves. It infected families, spreading across generations. Researchers have documented higher rates of addiction, mental health issues, and family dysfunction in children of Vietnam veterans compared to the general population. The war's damage extended far beyond the 58,220 names on the wall. The cultural legacy is complex. Vietnam transformed American society's relationship with war, government, and military service. The credibility gap that opened when Americans realized their government had lied about the war has never closed. The Pentagon Papers, published in 1971, proved that policymakers knew Vietnam was unwinnable years before admitting it publicly. Watergate followed. Then Iran-Contra. Then Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. Each scandal traced its lineage to Vietnam, to the foundational break in trust between American citizens and their government. The military learned from Vietnam, but not always the right lessons. The Powell Doctrine, overwhelming force, clear objectives, exit strategy, public support, was formulated in response to Vietnam's failures. It worked in the Gulf War. It failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, which became forever wars that repeated many of Vietnam's mistakes with different geography. The lesson that some wars simply cannot be won through military force remains difficult for America to accept. For the individual grunt, the infantryman who walked point through rice paddies in triple canopy jungle, who watched friends die for nothing, who came home broken, the legacy is personal and permanent. They didn't lose the war. The war was lost before they arrived. They simply paid the price for decisions made in Washington and Saigon, by people who never heard a bullet fired in anger. Private First Class Michael O'Brien, who we met stepping off a C-130 in January 1967, survived his tour. He came home with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and psychological wounds that never healed. He worked construction, married, had 2 children, divorced, and struggled with alcoholism for decades. He attended PTSD therapy at the VA beginning in 1985. He found some peace, though not enough. He died in 2019 at age 71. His obituary mentioned his service in Vietnam in a single sentence. His son, Michael O'Brien Jr., said at the funeral, "The war killed my father slowly over 50 years. It just took that long for him to die from his wounds." That's the legacy of the Grunt. They survived but didn't escape. They came home but never left. They lived, but in a way that was less than living. And America owes them acknowledgement, support, and the promise that their sacrifice, however futile the war, mattered because they mattered. It was a war of fire. It was a war of doubt. It was a war that changed America forever. Subscribe to Vietnam War Archives for more untold stories. Share in the comments what this war means to you or your family.